How Jake McNiece used Browning 50 M2 in 1945 with calm under fire to save lives. Overlooked. The Browning 50 caliber M2 sat wedged against the crumbling stone wall of the farmhouse like a wounded animal. Barrel still warm, tripod legs splayed at an awkward angle that made McNiece's shoulder ache every time he pressed into the spade grips. March fog hung thick over the Rhineland flatlands near Wesel, turning the tree line 200 yards out into grey smudges that could hide a platoon or nothing at all. Behind him, in the farmhouse cellar that smelled of turnips and old blood, 8 paratroopers from scattered units, 101st, 82nd, 2 glider infantry who'd lost their whole company in the drop, waited in silence broken only by the wet, laboured breathing of 3 men who couldn't walk. Jake McNiece crouched behind the machine gun, mud caked across his knuckles, and listened to German voices drifting through the fog, boots on frozen grass, the metallic click of a rifle bolt, the kind of sounds that made your spine go cold even after 3 years of this. 20 minutes, that's what the radio runner had said before the battery died. 20 minutes until the evac trucks could reach them. McNiece looked at the ammunition belt snaking from the 50 cal's receiver. Maybe 200 rounds left, maybe less. He was a demolitions NCO. He blew bridges. He didn't man machine guns. But he was the only one standing between the cellar full of broken men and whatever was moving through that fog, and somehow that made him the calmest man in the farmhouse. This wasn't supposed to be his fight. Earlier that morning, the filthy 13 had been 3 miles north, rigging charges on a railway trestle that fed German supply lines across the Rhine. Clean job. Simple math. Set the timers, pull back, watch the steel come down. Then a runner from a scattered glider company stumbled into their position, sleeve torn, face grey with shock, babbling about wounded men trapped in a farmhouse under German patrol pressure. The lieutenant overseeing McNiece's demo team gave the order without looking up from his map. Stick to the mission. Let someone else handle it. McNiece saw the blood-soaked coordinates scrawled on the runner's palm, saw the pleading in his eyes, and made a choice that would never appear in any after-action report. He grabbed 2 men from his squad, scavenged what ammunition they could carry from a burned half-track, and moved south through hedgerows still smoking from yesterday's shelling. When they reached the farmhouse, the scene was worse than described. Flat ground, no cover, 3 men gut-shot or shrapnel-torn, feverish and fading. The only heavy weapon was this Browning, salvaged from a wrecked Willys Jeep and jury-rigged onto the wall by a sergeant who'd bled out before dawn. McNiece test-fired a short burst to check the weapon's alignment. The recoil nearly tore the mount loose. He wedged a chunk of brick under the tripod leg, adjusted the traverse, and settled in. His voice came out flat, stripped of anything but cold calculation. Anyone runs, you're dead in 10 yards. We hold until the trucks arrive. I'll keep their heads down. You reload when I say. Through the fog, he saw movement. 8 shapes, low and careful, testing the farmhouse's response. McNiece let them close to 150 yards, then opened up. 3-second bursts, walking fire across their line of approach. The 50 cal's bark shook dust from the rafters. The Germans scattered, dove for cover. McNiece didn't chase them. He counted the remaining belt. 190, 180. He was rationing heartbeats. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. In the cellar, Private First Class Eddie Gorman pressed his back against the cold stone wall and tried not to look at the 3 men laid out on barn doors that served as stretchers. One kept whispering for his mother. Another had stopped making sounds 2 hours ago, but his chest still moved in shallow, arrhythmic heaves. Gorman had jumped into Normandy with the 101st, survived Market Garden, walked through frozen Belgian woods in December. But he'd never felt this trapped, this helpless. Above them, the Browning fired again. Short, controlled bursts that made the whole building shudder. Then silence, then another burst. Gorman knew that sound. Discipline, economy, Someone who understood that panic burned through ammunition faster than any German advance. He didn't know McNiece well, knew the reputation. The Filthy 13, the troublemakers, the Mohawks and war paint, the demo NCO who argued with officers and somehow never got court-martialed. Gorman had seen him once in a staging area, fixing a satchel charge while smoking a cigarette, looking bored. Now that same man was upstairs with a weapon he probably wasn't trained on, buying time Gorman wasn't sure they had. McNiece came down the cellar stairs in a crouch, boots scraping on stone. His face was streaked with cordite residue, eyes red-rimmed but steady. He knelt next to the makeshift stretchers, checked pulses without speaking, then turned to Gorman. "Radio? Dead. Battery's gone." McNiece nodded like he'd expected it. "How long since the runner left?" 15 minutes, maybe 12. "They'll come." McNiece said it like a fact, not hope. He moved to the cellar's small window, peered through the gap in the boards. "They're probing. Not committed yet. Probably a patrol, not a platoon. They don't know how many of us are here." Another paratrooper, Kowalski from the 82nd, spoke up from the corner. "How much ammo you got left?" "Enough." "That's not an answer." McNiece turned, and for a second Gorman saw something flicker in his expression. Not anger, just a kind of tired honesty. "It's the only answer that matters right now. I fire when I need to. You pray the trucks get here before I run dry." He climbed back upstairs. Gorman heard him adjusting the gun, the metal-on-metal scrape of the mount. Then McNiece's voice, quieter, like he was talking to himself or the weapon. "Just like setting a charge. Measure twice. Fire once. Don't waste it." The next German probe came from a different angle, northeast, using a drainage ditch for cover. McNiece spotted the movement, swung the Browning, and fired a 5-second burst that tore divots in the frozen earth. The helmets disappeared. He counted the belt again. 140. The math was getting tighter. Kowalski appeared at the top of the cellar stairs, carrying something wrapped in canvas. "Found this in the Jeep wreckage. 50 cal belts, maybe 60 rounds." McNiece took it without smiling. "Good. That buys us another 3 minutes." 3 minutes? If I'm careful. McNiece fed the new belt into the receiver, his hands moving with the same precision Gorman had seen demo men use when crimping blasting caps. No wasted motion. No panic. Just sequence and timing. Outside, the fog was starting to thin. That was bad. Less cover for the Germans, but also less cover for whatever was happening on that road where the evac trucks were supposed to be rolling. McNiece settled back behind the Browning, shoulders squared, breathing even. Gorman watched from the cellar door and realized something that made his chest tighten. McNiece wasn't just calm, he was terrified. And he was using that terror like fuel, burning it slow and controlled, the same way he'd burn a fuse. Oberleutnant Klaus Brenner crouched behind the stone remnant of what had once been a farm fence and studied the farmhouse through field glasses. The structure sat exposed on flat ground, tactically indefensible, which made him suspicious. Why were they still there? Why not withdraw through the hedgerows to the south? Unless they couldn't withdraw. Unless someone was wounded, trapped, or waiting for extraction. He'd been chasing scattered American airborne units for 3 days, ever since the Rhine crossing operations turned this sector into chaos. His patrol, 12 men, exhausted, low on ammunition, nerves frayed, had stumbled onto this farmhouse by accident. The first probe had drawn heavy fire, a 50 caliber by the sound. American, accurate, controlled. Brenner lowered the glasses and turned to his sergeant. 1 gun, maybe 2. They're rationing ammunition. Could be a trap, or desperation. Brenner studied the tree line, the angles of approach, the thinning fog. They're waiting for something. Reinforcement or transport. We press them before it arrives. The sergeant's face was hollow with exhaustion. We lost 2 men in the last probe. We lose this sector if they hold that farmhouse. Brenner checked his watch. Orders were to clear resistance and secure the road junction. Simple, brutal, necessary. He gave the signal, flank from the east, suppressing fire from the ditch line. McNiece saw the shift before it happened, the way shadows moved differently in the fog, the sudden stillness that meant men were getting into position. He swung the Browning east, tracking movement he felt more than saw. His hands were steady on the grips, but his mind was screaming. 120 rounds. Maybe less. Trucks still not here. 8 men, depending on him to hold this line with a weapon he'd learned to operate from a 15-minute crash course, and 3 years of watching other people die when the 50 cal jammed or overheated. The German MG-42 opened up first, from a barn ruin 300 yards out, long traversing bursts that raked the farmhouse wall and sent stone chips flying. McNiece ducked, counted the seconds of fire, waited for the barrel change. Silence. 5 seconds. He pivoted the Browning, aimed at the barn's window frame, and put 10 rounds through it in a tight pattern. The MG-42 went quiet, but now the flank was moving. Helmets bobbing in the drainage ditch, 20 meters closer than the last probe. McNiece had a choice. 30 rounds left in the current belt, 60 in reserve. Suppress the ditch and risk the frontal approach, or hold fire and let them close to knife-fighting range. He made the call. Kowalski, Gorman, front windows, rifles. Anything moves, you put it down. Then he swung the Browning hard east and fired in short, hammering bursts, aiming not for kills but for fear, stitching the ditch line with heavy rounds that sent mud and frozen earth into the air. The Germans broke, retreated. McNiece stopped firing, let the barrel cool, and counted again. 23 rounds left in this belt. His hands were shaking now, not from adrenaline, from the realization that he'd just spent half his remaining ammunition on a gamble, trusting 2 riflemen to cover the front while he turned his back to the main threat. The kind of decision that looked smart in after-action reports and felt like suicide in the moment. Behind him, Gorman fired twice. A German helmet disappeared into the hedgerow. McNiece reloaded the last belt. 60 rounds. That was it. No more scavenging, no more miracles. Just 60 chances to keep 8 men alive long enough for trucks that might not come. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The sound of diesel engines cut through the fog, distant, maybe a mile out, maybe less. The evac trucks. McNiece heard them and felt something loosen in his chest, then tighten again. A mile, 2 minutes of rolling time on a clear road, 4 or 5 if they hit resistance or had to navigate debris, and the Germans were regrouping for another push. 60 rounds. That's what stood between salvation and slaughter. McNiece kept his eyes on the tree line, on the ditch, on every shadow that moved wrong. His shoulders burned from the gun's recoil. His ears rang from the sustained fire. But his breathing stayed measured. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the same rhythm he used when crimping blasting caps or threading detonation cord through a bridge's support beams. Demolitions taught you that panic was just another form of explosive. Burn it too fast and it consumed you. Burn it controlled and it became power. Movement, northeast corner, 3 Germans breaking from cover, trying to close the gap while McNiece was focused elsewhere. Kowalski saw them first, fired, missed. Gorman fired, hit one. The other 2 went to ground. McNiece had 15 seconds to decide. Shift fire to the northeast and suppress them, or hold position and trust the riflemen to keep them pinned. 15 seconds. That's all any choice ever came down to. The space between hesitation and commitment, between doctrine and instinct. He stayed on the main approach. Didn't move the gun, didn't waste a single round. Kowalski, Gorman, northeast, 2 contacts, 50 meters. Put them down or make them think twice. Both men fired. The Germans stayed low. Then the MG-42 opened up again. From a different position this time, closer, maybe 200 yards. Long bursts that walked across the farmhouse wall. McNiece tracked the sound, found the muzzle flash in a hedge gap, and fired back. 5 rounds. The MG-42 stuttered, paused, resumed from 10 meters left. They'd moved the gun, smart, coordinated. This wasn't a probe anymore. This was a committed push. 42 rounds left. McNiece's mind shifted into the cold algebra of triage. If he burned 20 rounds suppressing the MG42, he'd have 22 for everything else. Flankers, frontal assault, last-ditch defense. If he saved ammunition and let the MG42 chew up the farmhouse, they'd be pinned when the trucks arrived, and the Germans would have clear fire on the evac. The Browning sat there between his hands, 5 feet of steel, wood, and American engineering that had never been designed to solve moral equations. But that's what it had become. Every trigger pull was a choice. Every burst was a bet. He fired. 10 rounds into the hedge gap. The MG42 went silent. 32 rounds. The diesel engines were louder now, close. McNiece could hear gears shifting, brakes squealing, voices shouting coordinates. The evac was almost here, almost. And the Germans knew it. They came all at once, from the ditch, from the hedgerow, from positions McNiece hadn't even spotted. Not a frontal charge, but a coordinated advance under suppressing fire, trying to close the distance before the trucks could extract the trapped men. McNiece saw them and understood with brutal clarity. This was the moment. The last 32 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition against however many soldiers were willing to die taking this farmhouse. He didn't pray, didn't curse, just settled into the gun, found the first target, and began firing in 3-round bursts, controlled, economical, every trigger pull backed by 3 years of learning how to make explosives do exactly what you needed when failure meant dead friends. The Browning bucked. Shell casings arced through the air. Germans dropped, scattered, kept coming. 18 rounds. 12. 6. McNiece heard the truck screech to a stop behind the farmhouse. Heard boots hitting ground, medics shouting, stretchers clattering. He fired the last burst into the tree line, not aiming for anyone, just buying 3 more seconds. And then the Browning clicked empty. Silence. He stayed behind the gun, hands still on the grips, waiting for return fire. It didn't come. The Germans had pulled back, not routed, just pulled back. Tactical withdrawal. They'd seen the trucks, done the math, decided the farmhouse wasn't worth the cost. McNiece's hands were shaking now, really shaking. He stood, legs unsteady, and walked to the cellar stairs. Move! Now! Get them loaded! 23 years later, McNiece would sit in a VA hospital waiting room in Oklahoma, watching a freight train roll past on elevated tracks outside the window, and feel his hands start to shake. Not from age, not from the Parkinson's that would come later, just from the sound. Steel on steel, rhythmic and relentless, like a Browning. 50 caliber cycling through its final belt. He'd never told anyone the whole truth about that farmhouse near Wesel, not the official debriefers, not the men who'd been there, not even himself, most nights. The truth was simple and terrible. He'd been guessing. Every burst fired, every decision to suppress or conserve, every moment of apparent calm, all of it built on educated guesses backed by nothing more solid than 3 years of not dying yet. He hadn't known if the MG42 would relocate or withdraw. Hadn't known if the flank attack was a feint or the main effort. Hadn't known if those last 32 rounds would be enough, or if he'd just sentenced 8 men to die 10 seconds before salvation arrived. The moment that haunted him most wasn't the fighting. It was after the last round fired, when he'd stood up from behind the Browning and seen Kowalski staring at him from the cellar door. The kid's face had been white, eyes wide, looking at McNiece like he was some kind of hero, and McNiece had wanted to grab him by the collar and scream, "I almost killed you." I turned my back on the front approach. I bet your life on 2 rifles against a German platoon. I had no idea if it would work, but he hadn't said anything. Just, "Move, get them loaded." The after-action report filed 3 days later mentioned a successful defensive action by elements of the 101st Airborne Division near Wesel. No names, no details. The railway trestle demolition McNiece had abandoned to reach that farmhouse got a paragraph and 3 commendations for the lieutenant who'd ordered him not to go. McNiece never filed a complaint, never asked for recognition. Part of it was his natural contempt for medals and paperwork. But the part he didn't examine too closely, was relief. If they wrote it up, someone might ask questions, might realize he'd disobeyed direct orders, might look closely at his decisions and see all the places where luck had masqueraded as skill. Captain Hendricks, the officer who'd commanded the trestle demolition, found McNiece 2 weeks after Wesel in a barn outside Berchtesgaden, where the filthy 13 were drinking captured schnapps and arguing about baseball. Hendricks pulled him aside, face tight with something between anger and confusion. "I got a runner's report. Said you pulled 3 men off our demo to go chase some glider outfits problem." McNiece met his eyes. "Yes, sir. Cost us an hour on the trestle. Could have cost us the whole mission if the Germans had come through early." "Could have, sir. Didn't." Hendricks stared at him. 8 men walked out of that farmhouse. 3 of them would have bled out without evac. "I heard that, sir." "You had no authority, no orders, no—" Hendricks stopped, shook his head. "Why?" McNiece thought about lying, about giving some answer that sounded clean and heroic. Instead he said, "Saw the coordinates on a kid's hand, covered in blood. Knew what it meant, went anyway." "That's not procedure." "No, sir, it's not." Hendricks stood there a long moment, then turned and walked away. Never mentioned it again. But McNiece saw it in his face, the recognition that warfare had corners where procedure dissolved, and you either made a choice or you lived with not making one. The Browning 50 M2 sat abandoned on that farmhouse wall for 3 more days before a salvage crew recovered it. By then the barrel was warped from sustained fire, the mount broken. They scrapped it, melted it down, turned it into something else. McNiece carried it for the rest of his life. The evac trucks rolled through fog and scattered German fire, reaching the farmhouse with seconds to spare. Medics scrambled, loading the wounded onto canvas stretchers, while McNiece and the others provided covering fire with rifles and carbines. Gorman helped lift a gut-shot private into the truck bed, hands slipping on blood-soaked canvas. Kowalski stood at the farmhouse corner, firing measured shots at shadows in the tree line. McNiece was the last one to leave. He stood behind the Browning one final time, hands resting on the grips that were still warm from sustained fire. The weapon had saved them, or he had saved them with the weapon. Or luck had saved them, and the weapon was just steel and springs that happened to work when it mattered. He couldn't tell anymore. One of the medics, a kid from Texas with corporal stripes, grabbed his arm. "We gotta move, Sergeant. Now!" McNiece nodded, stepped away from the gun, and climbed into the truck. As they pulled away, he looked back once. The Browning sat there on the ruined wall, barrel pointed at nothing, surrounded by spent brass casings that caught the weak morning light. It looked like a monument, or a gravestone. He wasn't sure which. The farmhouse disappeared into fog. Eddie Gorman survived the war, went home to Pennsylvania, worked 40 years in a steel mill. He never forgot McNiece or that farmhouse. Tried to tell the story once, at a VFW hall in 1967, drunk and nostalgic, to a room full of veterans who'd been in their own desperate fights and weren't impressed by anyone else's. He got to the part about McNiece turning his back on the main approach to suppress the flankers, trusting 2 riflemen to hold the line. Someone interrupted. "That's stupid. Could have got everyone killed." Gorman stared into his beer. "Yeah, could have. Didn't. So what? Luck. Maybe." Gorman looked up. "But I've seen a lot of scared men make a lot of scared choices. McNiece was terrified. I saw it in his hands, his eyes, the way he counted those last rounds like they were heartbeats. But he made it look like calm, made it feel like someone knew what they were doing. And maybe that's all heroism ever is, being scared and doing it anyway, making the choice even when you don't know if it's right." The room went quiet. Then someone changed the subject to baseball, and the moment passed. Gorman never told the story again, But sometimes, when freight trains passed near his house, he'd pause whatever he was doing and listen to the steel-on-steel rhythm, and remember a farmhouse in Germany where a troublemaking demolitions NCO had used a weapon he barely understood to buy 8 men a future. The official records from March 1945 near Wessel mention scattered defensive actions, railway demolitions, and the general chaos of the Rhine crossing. If you search for McNiece's name in connection with a Browning 50 caliber and a farmhouse rescue, you'll find nothing. The 8 men who walked out of that cellar knew different. They carried the truth in private silences, in hands that shook at unexpected sounds, in the way they never questioned what calm under fire actually cost. Some of them sought McNiece out after the war, awkward reunions in diners and VFW halls, shared drinks that became shared silence. None of them asked him how he'd done it. They already knew the answer wasn't something you could teach or write in a manual. It was just a demolitions NCO who understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was fear measured and burned at exactly the right rate, controlled like a fuse, steady like hands crimping blasting caps despite the trembling. The Browning became legend in its absence. No commendations, no photos. Just whispered stories among paratroopers about the time McNiece saved 8 lives with a weapon he'd never been trained on, firing with the calm of a man who knew that under fire, precision mattered more than fury. It was the overlooked kind of heroism, the kind that doesn't make headlines because it's too quiet, too internal, too much about what you carry afterward to be easily celebrated. McNiece carried it for 53 more years. Carried the memory of 32 rounds and 8 lives and the thin line between discipline and disaster. Carried the Browning's weight long after the weapon itself was melted down and forgotten. He never spoke about it publicly. But sometimes, in the Oklahoma twilight, he'd stand on his porch and listen to trains in the distance, and his hands would shake with a truth the official histories would never record. Legends are light as paper, but memory is steel. And the real weight of heroism is what you carry in silence after the guns go quiet. Udil, if this story reminded you that behind every medal and mission report there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.